next year, we will reach out to you, converse with you, dream with you to reimagine our city for the future. As part of our review of our long-term land use plans, we seek your inspiration and ideas to partner you to shape Singapore. And I hope to meet many of you in the coming months.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the World City Summit 2021 webinars. I am Ren Ai, your MC. Thank you for joining us at Hope You're Well, Building Healthy and Happy Cities. In a few moments, I will introduce Ms. Teoh Zsin Woon, our moderator, who will introduce our panelists. This will be followed by a moderated discussion with our panelists and an audience Q&A. Simultaneous interpretation in Mandarin is available for this webinar. To access this, click on the Interpretation tab on your Zoom toolbar and then select Chinese. Some of you have already submitted questions to our speakers in advance, but you can also ask questions using the Q&A tab. If you need any help, please use the raise hand function. We are pleased to announce that today's webinar is organized to support Singapore's Urban Redevelopment Authority Long-Term Plan Review, which begins with a year-long public engagement exercise to review Singapore's long-term land use needs and strategies, and shape a collective vision to chart Singapore's next chapter. This WCS webinar will share urban strategies and ideas that the public and private sector can explore for Singapore and other cities of the future. Today's event is also held in partnership with the Urban Sustainability R&D E-Symposia 2021, a year-long series of webinars co-organized by 20 ministries and agencies. Through these webinars, the E-Symposia seeks to share with the community the RIE 2025 research plans under the urban solutions and sustainability domain, and to forge new partnerships to both promote interdisciplinary research and translate research outcomes for deployment. With that, let us dive right into our speakers sharing for Hope You're Well, Building Healthy and Happy Cities. It is with great pleasure that I introduce our moderator for this session, Ms. Teoh Zsin Woon, Second Permanent Secretary of both the Ministry of National Development and the Public Service Division. I will now leave the next segment in her hands. Ms. Teoh, please.
Thank you, and a very good afternoon, everyone. I'm Zsin Woon, and it's my pleasure to facilitate this afternoon's webinar titled Hope You're Well, Building Healthy and Happy Cities. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and my special appreciation to all our panelists for taking time to participate in today's discussion with all of us. We certainly hope to hear and distill the insights from our panel of speakers on the urban strategies and practices that both the public as well as the private sectors can adopt to build healthier and happier cities of the future. Before we go into the session proper, let me first introduce our distinguished panel. Joining us today on the panel are, first we have Professor Lam Khee. Prof. Lam is the Dean of the School of Design and Environment from the National University of Singapore. Professor Lam is an architect, educator, and researcher who specializes in computational design support systems for total building performance analysis and building diagnostics. He is a building performance consultant for several major award-winning projects and certified green buildings in Singapore, in China, and the USA. We also have with us today Mr. Sima Xiao, Dean and Chief Planner of the Urban Planning and Design Institute of Shenzhen. He has been really committed to the first-tier urban planning and design for more than 30 years and has presided over and participated in more than 300 planning and design research and application projects. Over the years, he has achieved many awards for his academic and professional successes and has won more than 40 prizes at the national and provincial level. We also have next Mr. Curt Garrigan. He is the Chief Sustainable Urban Development Section of the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, or UNESCAP. In his role, Mr. Garrigan contributes to ESCAP's efforts to promote sustainable urban solutions in cities throughout this region. And finally, but not the least, we have Mr. Brian Young. He is the partner of the Bjarke Ingels group. Brian Young joined BIG in 2007 and has been the project leader on numerous award-winning projects. And I understand too that Brian has a background in energy efficiency research as well as, in economics. So he brings additional focus on environmental and economic sustainability into all of his projects. So first of all, let me welcome all our distinguished panelists. Again, we have a very interesting topic today, and that is, planning and designing and activating a city for the health of its residents. Now, this is not a new theme, but, with the onset of COVID-19, health and wellness has certainly become top of mind for all of us across the globe, as all cities grapple with and respond to the many challenges posed by COVID-19. At the same time, I think the disruptions posed by COVID-19 has forced us to be even more sensitive to plan our spaces for live, work, and play with public health considerations in mind, right? And on top of that, I think mental health has also emerged as a key area of focus because of the stresses brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic. And also that, as I was saying, we have reduced opportunities to meet face-to-face, and really that has also taken a toll in terms of mental health. So really in this very different world, right? How do we build a city? How do we plan spaces within buildings, design neighborhoods and districts, and master plan a cityscape to create the best environment for its residents, not just to live, but to thrive and flourish as healthy and happy individuals? So let us begin this discussion by inviting our panelists to share their perspectives to this question. What makes a city happy and healthy? And how can we plan and build cities to be happy and healthy cities? So first, I'd like to invite Prof. Lam Kipo to share his insights with us. Prof. Lam, please.
Thank you very much, PS, for the kind introduction, and very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all to the organizers for inviting me to participate in today's webinar. Okay, let me perhaps start by trying to define the term happy and healthy and its relationship to cities and their inhabitants. Well, it was the Greek philosopher Aristotle who said this 2000 years ago: happiness is the meaning and purpose of life, the whole aim and end of human existence. So happiness and health are indeed observable and to some extent measurable physiological, psychological, and sociological states of human beings. And studies have found that happy people tend to be healthier people due to lifestyle choices. So a healthy city, therefore, must create inspiring and enabling physical and social environments to support such choices. So the focus then must be on the people that cities are built to accommodate and serve. I believe there is unanimous consensus that we must adopt a people-centric approach to what we do in our natural as well as our built environment. Yet let's think about it. How much do we in the building industry really understand what those complex and dynamically changing human needs are, or spend adequate time or resource either in conducting contextually relevant research or assimilate findings from the experts in medicine, public health, social sciences, etc. in our design? I would like to underscore the point about being contextually relevant. While there may be well-established research methodologies, we all know that it does not imply that any city or country can simply import those results from elsewhere and apply them directly in our own built environment development. The results may not be contextually relevant due to the variances in demographics, social, cultural, and economic settings. There is no shortcut in conducting localized research to derive locally relevant data to inform our design. It is said that if you are a hammer, everything will look like a nail. So we design things that are based on many assumptions that we make from existing weather conditions through our weather files. Remember that I'm a simulation person. We use weather files. And those weather files are rapidly becoming obsolete because of climate change. And then we rely on standardized programmatic requirements, often dictated by current building standards and regulations, which by nature codify historical, well-proven, and economically acceptable base level solutions, I call them. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with that, okay? But it certainly is not a means to future-proof and make our cities resilient against foreseeable catastrophes brought about by pandemics and climate change. So let me end by summarizing and suggesting 3 practical strategies of actions we can and must take. Number 1, we need to establish a holistic governance framework that will coalesce policies and ensure equitable resource distribution and allocation to tackle what so many have called the wicked problems head on. It's commonly referred to as a whole of government approach, as Singapore has also adopted. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, with its 17 Sustainable Development Goals adopted by the UN member states back in 2015, should be our constant point of reference. Those goals all directly or indirectly contribute to our happiness and health. Second point, real estate investors, especially from the private sector, must play their part in partnership with the public sector to derive this human-centric life cycle approach to building our cities, and not merely treat real estate development as a commodity to be built and then traded. Remember that whatever we build, it is here to stay with us for a very long time, for better or for worse. So the last point is, given this clear development aspirations, which I hope everybody would embrace, as well as those goals for our city, then the professional teams that are ultimately responsible for making it all happen must also work in an integrated cross-disciplinary manner to deliver a truly sustainable and operationally maintainable healthy end product. And please do not forget to reach out to our allied professional experts in, as I said earlier, in the social sciences, in the public health and allied domains to seek critical input to further enlighten our design requirements. I would suggest that we shouldn't wait for this to appear in our building regulations and standards because doing that might become too late. Just within the last 2 years, the pandemic has taught us the importance of being flexible and adaptable, where our home has become an office, and now even as a COVID-19 recovery space, our community centers have become vaccination centers, and so on and so forth. So the bottom line is this: we must truly understand, be empathetic, and care for the people who live, work, and play in the built environment that we create, while being sensitive to the delicate ecological balance with the natural environment. So whatever each country's economic and development status is at this moment, invest in people, provide them with good supporting infrastructure, and your return on investment is guaranteed. I think Singapore is a good testament to that approach, and the transformation of our city-state in its relatively short nationhood of 56 years is self-evident. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof, for those very succinct but very powerful strategies that you have left us with. Let me next invite Dean Sima to share his perspectives. Dean Sima, please.
非常感谢峰会的邀请，感谢主持人。下面呢，我想结合深圳的实践，与大家交流分享一下健康城市规划建设的一些思考。深圳呢，在短短的40年时间里，由一个边陲小镇发展成具有全球影响力的国际化大都市，造就了世界城市发展史上的奇迹。
a very small town or village to a globally influential metropolitan city. So it could be said to be a magic, a miracle in city building history in the world. The fast growth of Shenzhen also led to a high level of development and especially within limited land resources. In South China, we know that there is a very high population density and it is a heavily developed and also a heavily planned kind of city. As a result, the three high or high level kind of feature also brought a lot of challenges. We understand that people nowadays have very high expectation of living standards in cities. So how do we serve the diverse demand or expectation of the residents to meet their expectation of lifestyle, of having easy access to nature and to have leisure time? We also need to build city into a kids-friendly and inclusive city. So we have made certain efforts. For example, we have launched the programs to connect the mountain with the sea, to integrate the city building by leveraging all the natural resources, including its reserve of woods, lake, grassland, and wetland. We have also planned a holistic structure that includes a mountain ridge, a coastal belt, and 18 corridors to try to build an eco-friendly city that is well connected, that is systematic. So I mentioned that we have one mountain ridge, one coastal belt, which we call the blue belt. We also have 8 mountain corridors and 10 waterway corridors together, in addition to more than 100 lanes and more than 10,000 small or large parks. By leveraging these resources, we bring ecosystem and nature to the residents, and we provide, and based on this, we build a more agile infrastructure. So connectivity with the ecosystem and connectivity with life or with living environment. All this is centered on people to bring nature to them, to try to provide public services without borders. We also try to provide connectivity with interesting, fun lifestyle. For example, we have the water corridor, which is one of the centers of it, which is in the center of our urban district. It's directly connected with the Science and Technology Park, with more than one institutions of high learning, and also connected with the greenlands and the parks. And it's downstream, the Dashahe River, the downstream is connected with the Shenzhen Bay, where a lot of young people live and work. So we try to provide high quality living standards by integrating these natural resources with the culture of innovation and good commercial experience. The urban central CBD is actually very close to the central mountain. So we try to build a regional infrastructure with low disturbance. And one of the principles is to minimize disturbance and have a light construction. We worked with NGOs and volunteers to design some walkways so that the residents have easy access to the mountains. We have also, for example, set up observation decks 24-hour city observation platform so that it's easy for the residents to walk up to the high points to observe the beauty of the city. So basically, through these programs of mountain and ocean connectivity, we try to protect the ecosystem to bring nature to urban life. Secondly, I also mentioned the goal to build Shenzhen into a kids-friendly, a children-friendly city. This was a target that we launched in 2016 and was the first in China. Under that philosophy, we built a city walkway circle and the area that is safe for the children to carry out activity alone. At 3 different levels, we try to meet the standards of so that the children feel both inclusive and sense of security. All these are explorations and experiments we have carried out in Shenzhen. For example, the children's fun parks, as is illustrated here. This children's fun park is centered on some sand playground and the water parks to provide games space. So it has become a quite popular destination for families. In the process, and when we design all these, we also encourage the creativity and the imagination to include game space. We work together with partners like Bjarke, which is a developer. Together, we have launched the Bjarke, a big dreamer plan to identify those spots in the city that are not kids friendly. We bring the children to better know about the city they live in. We invite them to participate in design workshops and encourage and guide them to participate so that together we build a children friendly city in Shenzhen. We hope that we can make Shenzhen a healthy, a happy city for all residents. So this is what we have done in Shenzhen, and some of our thoughts and some of our experiments, which I have shared with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sima, for those really impressive sharing of the city design and actually having the children at the center of it. Next, I'd like to invite Mr. Curt Garrigan to share his views on this topic as well. Over to you, Curt.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thanks to the organizers for including me and UNESCAP. I'm going to share a few slides, and I think this is one of those sessions where you'll have a lot of consensus among the panelists on what makes a city healthy and happy. But I'm just going to go a little bit through some of ESCAP's work, just for the benefit of the audience. ESCAP is essentially the regional development arm of the UN. We have 53 member states and 9 associate members, and we serve as an intergovernmental platform. We support capacity building and knowledge sharing across the region. You've already heard from Professor Lam about the importance of SDGs, and what we look at are helping member states and cities and local authorities to help to localize the SDGs. While there is an SDG on cities, we feel that based on the categories and the operations of cities, whether it be infrastructure, partnerships, equity, or environmental resources, that you could essentially identify contributions to the SDGs across cities. Unfortunately, in the region, the progress against the SDGs has been limited. And in fact, there are some SDGs where there is actual regression. And that includes on climate action, and the contribution of cities will be essential in achieving the SDG on climate action. But there simply has not been enough progress in the region, including on SDG 11. So as we get to the future of cities and how to ensure health and well-being, we know that there are issues related to energy and planning energy demand and consumption. But there are some emerging issues, such as air pollution, which is a common issue across the region, in many cities across the region. In fact, 19 of the top 20 cities in the region are among the most polluted. And there simply is not enough happening or enough policies to control air pollution. And there's a high percentage of urban populations that are vulnerable to the effects of climate change. So one of the key steps and action points to take is really to reduce the risks and the vulnerabilities of populations, of urban populations. Someone cannot feel happy if they feel always at risk or vulnerable to natural disasters that are outside of their control. So the key really is managing our environments and our urban environments, whether it be clean air, clean water, protecting biodiversity, and natural resources. I think there would be consensus among this panel that maintaining a connection with nature and providing public spaces and green spaces for social interactions are key to healthy and happy cities. But we also need to recognize that the future happiness and future healthiness of populations really requires a foundation of low carbon and climate resilience. And cities really have an opportunity and really an obligation to focus on those transitions. And I think the pandemic has certainly exposed the need to better integrate health and quality of life in urban and territorial planning. UNESCAP has done some work and released a report called The Future of Asian Pacific Cities, and we identify various policy pathways to achieve that. And then following that work during the pandemic, we identified specific policy pathways for recovery that integrated those quality of life and health standards. So we say that there are four main pillars, regardless of the starting point of cities, and that includes urban and territorial planning, urban resilience, smart and inclusive cities, and urban finance to help finance all. And each of those have their own policy pathways. I'd like to just highlight a few. And again, integrating sustainability and quality of life targets in the planning of cities, planning of urban spaces and future cities is critical. But that needs to be done with citizens. So solutions need to be co-produced, not just a government effort, but co-produced. And I think the video earlier on was really reflective of Singapore's approach to engaging communities. I won't go through all of what I have here, but there are examples across the region of how citizens are engaged in urban and territorial planning efforts. But one of the things that has emerged during the pandemic is how we use urban and territorial planning as a spatial vaccine. We need to look at health-related targets. We need to identify alternative solutions, also to provide basic services, and look at urban and rural linkages as well. And there are obviously some specific actions that contribute to those objectives, including on housing. I think we all know and will all support more nature-based solutions and increasing biodiversity in cities, and that has multiple benefits, including on the health side. One of the things that we encourage is also engaging the informal sector in all of these solutions. So things like wetlands and looking at biodiversity, water harvesting, rain gardens, etc., have multiple benefits and contribute to healthy communities. And we know that there are lots of opportunities on the digital side, including for access to e-health services. So there are, again, areas where cities can leverage technologies to increase the health of their communities, and those solutions, again, can be co-produced. On finance, I'll skip over because there are obviously some issues related to the ability of cities to finance all of these solutions. But looking at affordable housing, looking at land-linked financing, incorporating nature into the land plans, all contribute to resilience and the value of land and communities. And then Finally, I just want to point out that we will be having a regional partners forum next week, and we would invite participants to join that forum because many of these same issues will be discussed in that forum. But thanks, and I look forward to the remainder of the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Curt. And finally, can I invite Mr. Brian Young to share his insights as well? Brian, please.
Greetings from Copenhagen. Thank you for the introduction and the kind invitation to participate today. As we've all experienced in the course of what is coming up to almost 2 years now, daily human life has really been distilled to its bare essentials. And the impact of this has been felt especially in dense urban areas, cities that until now have been celebrated as bastions of innovation, creativity, and diversity. But the inequality in how many of our cities have developed, their continual growth masking similarly growing contradictions in quality of life, has really been revealed by the stress tests of the pandemic. And so, as you know, for many, the last couple of years has meant spending months in small apartments with limited direct access to the outdoors and other people, and the need to balance child rearing and work responsibilities isolated in the same confined space continuously over days, weeks, and months, leading in some instances to a kind of existential crisis. For example, the ongoing phenomenon that is now called the Great Resignation in the US. As a consequence of work and life being put into blatant competition one with the other, and a need for people to rethink priorities and sacrifices they make in pursuit of them. But this is also an opportunity for us to reimagine what cities, as collections of communities, need not just to survive, but to thrive. Drawing from our experience here in Copenhagen, for about 4 months last year, there was a lockdown of restaurants, shops, coffee shops, a common experience, I think, for everyone. Everything except businesses considered critical to the functioning of society. So this meant that bakeries, for example, were the only place where you could buy a coffee, the place where you could meet your neighbor in the relative security of the outdoors, where everyone was lining up because only 2 people at a time were allowed inside. These spaces, along with plazas and parks, became the center of social life, spaces to rediscover the city and nature within. So these images are just a couple I took of urban explorations I went on with my daughter during the lockdown when she was home with us. But we've been relatively fortunate here in Denmark that much of the built environment is community-centric, very much based on the traditional perimeter block, organized around communal spaces at their heart, and towards the exterior, public spaces such as plazas and shared streets and surfaces. And this ethos really affects the sense of communal ownership of public space. So this is an image of where I live in Copenhagen, where in June of this year, the neighborhood literally occupied the streets to break bread together outside over dinner. In fact, here in Denmark, the pandemic has revived and made popular an old and somewhat obscure term dating back to 1936, samfundssind, which is a compound noun of samfund, meaning society, and sind, meaning minded. A reminder to, in times of isolation, look outward rather than inward with acts of kindness, collective responsibility, and community spirit. And when I compare our experience here to that of friends and family in the rest of the world, it's clear to me that we have been really privileged in the extent to which living in a city that prioritizes not just the public realm, but the community at both an architectural and urban level has really mitigated the impact of the pandemic and allowed us to feel well supported and part of a larger whole with a shared sense of purpose. So if I were to identify some meaningful specific elements of daily life as a part of this experience, it would be access to businesses that fulfill a socio-cultural role in the city, such as coffee shops and bakeries that are connected to plazas, open air places to gather that provide physical and psychological security while still feeling connected to those around you. Green spaces to breathe and run around that bring nature and biodiversity to your doorstep. And all of this tied together by micro mobility solutions that allow people options in how they move around the city to go to work, to transport themselves physically and mentally from one space to another. And this isn't just about quality of life per se, but also about social, economic, and environmental resiliency. So it's hard to stress enough the importance of equity in access to them. I thought it could be interesting to show what this could look like from an architectural perspective through a project we completed in 2010, and which really illustrates the power of community deployed at the scale of the city block. The 8 House is an experiment in extending the life of the street into the building so that it becomes a 3-dimensional neighborhood. with row houses, gardens, and pathways that stretch through the building and twist all the way from street to top and down again, creating a unique sense of community and intimacy, but with the density and programming of an urban perimeter block. Here, you still step out through your yard onto the street, even though you live on the top floor of a high-density development. And in the past year, these spaces have allowed the residents of the 8 House to continue to gather as a community, together even while apart. So I have a simple thesis that cities are made up of communities, and the resiliency of these communities constitutes the resiliency of the city. We need to reprioritize an equitable and accessible distribution of shared community-centric spaces in how we plan and adapt our architecture and our cities now and for the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. That's really fascinating. And I like your point about how the crisis has also become a great opportunity, you know, to rethink and actually emphasize some of the planning strategies that we have in terms of building around communities. So thank you very much, panelists, for the most generous sharing and insightful points. I thought I would like to maybe highlight a number of recurring themes that I'm hearing across your sharing. And the first and a very strong point, I think, that came up in several speakers sharing is about putting people at the center of the planning and the design. I think Prof. Lam talked about it. I think Brian talked about, you know, designing around the community. And I think Curt made the same point as well. And in fact, Mr. Sima's, Dean Sima's example, you know, showed quite clearly how some of the design and the planning were really built around the residents as well as the children of Shenzhen. The second element, I think, that was very clear that cut across many of the sharing is the need to maintain the greenery and to maintain that connection between the people as well as with nature, and that is quite important in terms of maintaining the sense of health and well-being. And third, most importantly, you know, maintaining and strengthening the social bonds and how we can think anew about the planning and about the placement of different users with the purpose of actually strengthening the connections and the bonds between people. So I thought these are three very strong recurring themes that I'm hearing across the sharing. And I think that sets the stage for a really exciting dialogue, I hope. Before we do that, it may be time for us to actually see what the audience thinks. So earlier, we did a poll when our participants for this webinar logged in, and we asked all of you what you think are the key elements of designing for happy and healthy cities. And this is what you say. I think top of the charts, you know, what makes healthier and happier cities, the most important element, almost 50%, you know, voted for parks and nature spaces. And the second element that stood out for people is actually about, you know, having inclusive and age-friendly infrastructure. And, you know, the other elements as well, very strong consensus as well in terms of active mobility, community spaces, you know, proximity to co-working spaces and amenities. So it appears that, you know, this connection with nature and connection, access to parks is really something that talks to almost everyone in terms of the key defining element of a healthy and happy city. Let us now perhaps start off the Q&A, and you know, I'm looking at many questions in the chat already. Perhaps to start us off, we could start with a broader question, such that we can hear and interact around this perspective, which is really that just now Sima shared about Shenzhen, and when he shared about Shenzhen, I was telling myself, yes, high density, and that's something that is Singapore is struggling with as well. How do we balance with limited resources, limited space? How do we better plan and design cities to promote the sense of well-being, even in the context of high density? So perhaps, I think this is a key, tension and a key challenge that many cities are faced with. Singapore certainly feels it. And if I look at Shenzhen, I think it's trying to find a beautiful balance between preserving the sense of well-being as well as, in a high density context. So perhaps I could first invite maybe would Prof Lam want to start us off in terms of how do we balance the varied needs of citizens, and how do we achieve that health and well-being in a highly dense living environment?
Okay, thank you, Pamsat. I think first of all, let's take the notion that high density is not necessarily an impediment or constraint to creating healthy and livable cities. Because if we do not step out of that sort of preconceived notion or bias, then it's very difficult to put on the creative and thinking cap to solve, right, the issues of resource constraint. And I think again here in Singapore, as an example, it's demonstrated that necessity is the mother of all invention, and therefore how do you house the population? How do you create industry? And yet at the same time has one of the world's highest green cover. All came about because confronted with that constraint, we put on a collective creative thinking hat and then allocate those resources and allocate those spaces by doing several very basic sort of steps. One is to say, look, do not sort of isolate and define things in boxes. That means you don't sort of do one thing for one thing only. You provide one thing for 5 purposes, so that there is multiple flexible use, not only in terms of the physical planning, but also in terms of the time of day. The ability to then create, activities, as it were, around the clock. The city planning and the town planning in Singapore is a great example. Even way before the COVID days, where you have this hierarchy of the town center and then the neighborhood and then the precinct, so that when COVID hit, you don't have to all run to the city center to shop. You could go to your neighborhood within a 5-minute walk and have your daily needs met. So yet all done within a high density environment, right? While maintaining open spaces for communal use. So I think that's the mindset that we need to change, and then put on much more effort and perhaps even time and resource to think through and to plan in a holistic and integrated way to optimize those resources. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. And I wonder if the rest of our panelists would like to also add on in terms of the question.
Yeah, I guess our perspective, as I mentioned in the opening, is obviously very much informed by our Danish roots, where much of housing, as I mentioned, places community and social life of residents as the center. And the project that I mentioned, the 8 House, is one example of contemporary adaptation to high density living through the use of architecture. And I really liked what Prof Lam said about one thing doing 5 things, because as architects, it's also very much the way we've been trying to work, where by creating this continuous path that essentially carves through the 2 blocks and connects all of the residents, you provide access to an outdoor street, even though you live on the 10th floor. You provide micro mobility solutions because you can access the top floor from the bottom on a bicycle. You provide setbacks that allow for light to access the units that sit deeper, and then create a kind of very open air environment. So I really love that idea and that way of thinking very pragmatically about the architecture. And just to give you a sense of the density of the 8 house, it actually is about 476 units and about 61,000 square meters with 10,000 square meters of commercial and retail spaces. So it truly has the kind of scale of the city block, but at the same time, the feeling of the kind of intimacy of living on a row house where you walk out to your street and your neighbors and their dogs are running around. So I think, we're completely aligned with this notion that somehow the embrace of density and the constraints can also allow you to develop creative and somewhat unexpected solutions. And maybe just from a kind of urban planning scale, I showed you an image of the street I lived on in Copenhagen. It's actually next to an old Carlsberg factory campus that's being redeveloped as a new residential area in the city. And it really takes elements from the medieval center of the city that is much cherished and adapts it for contemporary life. So in this case, it means about 600,000 square meters of residential, office, commercial, educational, cultural developments integrated alongside protected industrial buildings with towers that land on narrow streets on one side and spacious courtyards on the other. And these spaces create a network of 25 interconnected public spaces such as plazas and parks. So it's really this idea of somehow allowing, not saying it has to be one or the other, but that density and community life and intimacy can coexist in a way that allows you to add additional value to the cities that we inhabit.
Thanks very much, Brian. And I must say that I was quite blown away by the 8 house, and I can see at the human scale how that connectivity and that the ties among the residents is really quite amazing. And I think what you shared actually provides a lot of inspiration and encouragement, because what they're saying is actually that the city can continue to grow organically, and it's still full of surprises, can adapt to sort of the ever-changing needs of the people who live within the city. Excellent. Perhaps let me see if we could pull out a question from Shenzhen by some of our participants.
好，我接着回答刚才张教授提出来的几个问题。我还是
So let me try to answer the question just now. Again, let me use Shenzhen as an example. Shenzhen is a huge metropolitan city which originated from a small town. So high density and high standard of living are not contradictory. Through good planning, through good design, good methodology, incorporating new technology and good design, we are actually able to achieve livable, high quality living in a high density city environment, to make residents enjoyable. For example, Qianhai might be more familiar to some of you. In the past years, over this 15 square kilometers of land, we built a huge amount of residential and commercial facilities, almost equivalent to the size of Manhattan downtown. So our philosophy is that we make use of the natural environment, which has mountain and ocean in the periphery, in the vicinity, to build a city. So Qianhai Bay has the inner bay and also outer bay. So we designed a 200 to 500 meter wide belt, a corridor belt, it connects with the CBD, with the city. We also designed waterway. So there are altogether 5 quite scenic, quite beautiful waterway corridors, and they connect the mountains with the beach, with the residential and the commercial area. And we also put in some art elements. So these 5 corridors helped us to come up with a holistic design to provide livable options. So from Qianhai to the coast, to the water area, to the lake, to the mountain, you will find that it's a very small area. However, there's a high density residence there, and it looks quite orderly. So that's the kind of effort we have made in the past few years. The experiment we did in Qianhai, we try to provide good public services and to build the area into a world level, first class urban area, including walkways, including residential and commercial infrastructure, so that the residents can enjoy beach and the coast scenes. The second thing I want to share is some of experiments we did. For example, small micro primary schools or educational experiments facilities. In the past few years, because Shenzhen's population underwent explosive growth, and in the past there were not so many primary schools. Now there are so many young people that move in. We need to provide them with more primary schools. So we try to be innovative. For example, normally we have density requirements and design requirements for primary schools. They need playgrounds, they need sports facilities. We give them more liberty so that they can bring in new design elements to build these primary schools. Of course, we still put in place certain standards of design, but there is more flexibility in building these primary schools, so they save space. But actually, the primary schools are more integrated with the community. And we rolled out so-called community shared primary school facilities, so that the children, their school life is more integrated with community life. We also encourage diversified usage utilization of facilities. For example, Vertical City. Vertical City was originally in our planning. We brought in some utopian kind of design philosophy with the social economic growth, with the advancement of technology. We were able to do some experiments in Shenzhen, in places like a city like Shenzhen, which is a very dense city. We actually was able to implement some of those utopian ideas. For example, production, living, and ecology are brought together. So in the past, the functional areas were usually, just one single function, but we try to integrate production, industrial production with other functionalities, while making it still very livable, of course. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sima. I think indeed, the experience of Shenzhen does provide a lot of very practical reference for all of us. I am actually keeping watch on the time as well as the Q&A questions that you have posted. And so perhaps we shall take some of the questions that have been already posted in the Q&A. Let me pose this question to our panelists. It's one of the more popular questions from Ben Chang. He says that Prof. Lam shared about a whole of society approach that includes private sector participation. He would like to hear some of the strategies to encourage greater private sector participation. And I thought that as Curt, you earlier mentioned about co-delivery as well and co-creation. I'm just wondering whether you'd like to share your thoughts about the strategies to involve the different stakeholders, including the private sector, in creating healthy and happy cities.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I'll get to the question. I just wanted to touch on the issue of density as well. I think it's not so much the question of density, but it's more about the connectivity in the urban spaces. That's both the physical connectivity as well as the social connectivity. And I would echo also, Brian mentioned what Professor Lam had said about doing multiple things well. I think there are excellent examples of doing many different things in the context of connectivity. So nature-based solutions, for example, that look at rain gardens that have a stormwater management function to reduce flood risk, to help with water harvesting and cleansing, for resource efficiency where there's scarcity, to serve as recreational amenities, greening of urban spaces and reducing urban heat island effects. And also to serve as alternative transportation. One of the phenomenons of the pandemic is the increase in cycling. Brian lives in a city where that's famous for cycling, but in many other cities it has not been a very well utilized form of transportation. That may change, and that may change the way that we plan our cities. That includes, private developments, accommodating for bicycles, bicycle lanes. People may choose to cycle to work. So I think there are some trends that probably can be identified that are changing the way that we use cities. But for me, it's all about connectivity, not so much density. Now, with respect to engagement of private sector, I think some of the most successful urban spaces, I'm not going to say public spaces, but urban spaces have been privately developed or co-developed as public-private partnerships that link public space with private space or with commercial activities. I think it's not just the planning of public space and doing master plans. It's really identifying innovative and creative ways that private development can contribute to public space, and identifying where those amenities are, whether it be looking at greenways or bike paths. The private sector can really contribute to really accelerating those levels of connectivity. But those are often identified by not just the private sector, not by the government, but by the end users. And so really engaging with the community, engaging with the public and seeing where they're living, where they'd like to play, where they'd like to shop, and planning both the public and private developments to be responsive, I think is important. So thanks.
Thank you so much. And I'm just wondering if we could, also hear from Brian. Obviously, you've created many brilliant architecture for all of us.
Yeah, oddly enough, in our experience, much of the work we're involved in actually has been private sector led, in the sense that a lot of the clients who approach us in dense cities like New York and London do so because they've really reached the limits of how compact and efficient, for example, an apartment can be. And they're really driven to find new ways to think about how they can create value, not just for the residents that live in these places, but also for the surrounding community. So it's something that I think, the private sector realizes that their own success is somehow also tied to the life of the community that occupies the cities in which they build. I think a good example of a project we've recently done in Singapore, which is going to open soon, is Capital Spring, which occupies, which sits in the very heart of the historic CBD in Singapore on Market Street, where we've introduced a 30-meter high green space, 100 meters up in a skyscraper, which is going to be programmed across a diversity of use between live, work, and play, so cafe, workspaces, And the idea is that this will be publicly accessible. And to their credit, the developer Capital Land, we never had a single discussion about the economic returns of providing such a space, because there was a kind of deeper understanding that in the very heart of the CBD, that their success is also tied to the success of the building and its ability to attract people, to bring the life of the city up into the tower as well. I would say that from a participation perspective, one of the things that happens in Denmark, which is very important, is that every time you develop a new project, they make what's called a new local plan. And that process involves a series of public hearings where the community is also invited to provide their opinion about the development, about the massing, about the value that it adds to them as the future residents that will also, you know, be a part of the kind of extended community of that building.
Yeah, thanks very much. Actually, I was just wondering, maybe as if I may, a quick follow-up question about the citizen participation. I'm just wondering, you know, that the magnificent house of 8 that you have shown us, you know, was there citizen participation? You know, which aspects of that did they co-create?
So I think the participation in that project is really more in the kind of initial planning stages. But to give you a little bit of context, and maybe I would say a lot of the participation has happened after the fact, not for lack of effort, but because when that project was first built, it's built on kind of the outskirts of Copenhagen, and it was a new city center that was being designed to bridge the space between Copenhagen and Malmö, which is the second largest city in Sweden. And the idea was to make it a new kind of economic and development zone. So when the 8 house was built initially, I think as I showed in one of the slides, it was really the only building out there. Now it's completely surrounded by high density developments, so towers, perimeter blocks, for example. But at the time, it was kind of the anchor for the development around which the entire district grew around. But I think what's been amazing about the 8 house is the extent to which the community has really kind of taken ownership of the space and turned it into their own. So as I showed in some of the slides, you know, kind of completely proactively during the course of the pandemic, organizing communal dinners where people will bring their tables and occupy the path outside of their apartments, occupy the green space in the center, so that despite the fact that everyone is a little bit isolated in the individual apartments, there's still a feeling of togetherness and ownership of the space.
Yes, that's amazing. I mean, I love that picture that you've shown. I will now also then maybe call out some of the questions that were sent in by our participants earlier. There's one question. I don't know whether Nicole, you can flash it. That was sent in earlier as well, and I thought it was a good topic for discussion. Which is the part of the healthy part of it, which is, are there any known practices that combine nature spaces and infrastructure to promote active mobility in cities? For Singapore, we have our network of park connectors, and they're very, very popular among Singaporeans. Perhaps we could also learn from our panelists, the outstanding strategies or best practices in terms of promoting active mobility in cities. Perhaps I could call upon, Sima. Or Prof Lam.
好的，谢谢。
好。
我先说，谢谢。
Thank you.
是这样，这个还是以我熟悉的。
So maybe I will take Shenzhen as an example. More than 10 years ago, Shenzhen has been researching and developing green infrastructure with industry development to create green infrastructure. I'll give you 3 examples. The first is Qianhai industrial park. The second is the Hongshu Museum. The third is a regional water processing plant.
The first is the Qianhai Bay. We have 5 water routes, and they're part of the plan to mitigate flood risks. So we combined this flood prevention infrastructure with water culture to deploy facilities for exercising, entertainment, and social leisure purposes in there. So it's a very good example of a combination of the functional facilities with leisure purposes. The second example is that there is a bridge on top of a cover area on top of a subway system. So on top of that, we build a wetland museum and eco park. So from the park, you can actually have an outlook of 30 kilometers of the park with the forest, and combine the green nature with infrastructure. So it converts a public transportation infrastructure or facility to a living space with nature and culture. And the third example is a water processing plant. We create a inner surface plant, and on top of that, we have a museum, which is right beside a park, and then that create a whole ecologic development, and it combines the industrial space with the eco park and the museum together. So this used to be a negative public transport hub only, converted to a public space for social purposes. The third example, as I mentioned, is a water treatment or processing plant. We have adopted layered spaces design underground to process the wastewater, the runoff, and then on top of the surface we have greeneries, we have parks, we have functional facilities to combine culture, tourism, and leisure together with such a facility. So these are 3 examples of how we can recreate a space with nature and industrial use. And after the greener environment is created, it's also beneficial for people to go out and exercise. Thank you.
I wonder if our panelists, anybody would like to add on in terms of active mobility?
Yeah, if I could jump in and perhaps further extend on what Mr. Xiao have said. And PS, you have mentioned Singapore's Park Connector network as one feature, right? That is purposefully built to connect up the country. The other aspect, I think, has been alluded to by Mr. Xiao, is really about looking for opportunities of existing infrastructure that has outlived its original life, and then to be able to repurpose, right? Often we talk about redeveloping and tearing things down and so on, which of course is very wasteful and carbon intensive. I think we got to look for opportunities as well of existing infrastructure. A good example is the New York High Line, the railway track that have been repurposed and made extremely successful as a connector for Manhattan, and they're in fact extending it further as we speak in order to connect up a very, very dense city. And originally, of course, it was a railway track, and railway was in fact a good mode of transportation as opposed to cars. Now they are repurposing it and then to bring it back to the people, allowing a lot of pedestrian connectivity and walkability exercise, all very good. So that's, to me, a very, very good example. Here in Singapore, as you also know, and folks in Singapore know, we have also reclaimed the railway line, right? That used to run from Tanjong Pagar to Woodlands and connect to Malaysia. That has now been repurposed for a lot of this mobility. And what is most exciting, and it was just announced yesterday, that there's going to be a new innovative health district program, right, here in Singapore, that in fact offers now an opportunity to connect to this green rail corridor, we call it. And that will then further create this, what I earlier talked about, right? Not only, and Curt is absolutely right, it's about connectivity, it's about multi-purpose, so that they can, all the limited resources can in fact be maximized by all the constituent, people, whether you are in the housing or whether you are in commercial, and in this case, even cut through a hospital. And what's there to say that the recovering patients couldn't benefit from this mobility and from this interaction? So this is something that is very exciting, and really happy that just got announced yesterday. Look forward to that exciting initiative. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. And I think we have about 15 minutes left, and I thought that also as an extension of what Prof is saying, and I think Prof started us with the very basics, which is put people at the center of the design. I think we have a very good question about designing for an inclusive community. And maybe if I could ask the secretary to put the question out on screen. Okay. Yes. It says it's great to see the focus on children and family needs. And I think there's a lot of, applause for the Shenzhen example in the chat. But how can cities also address accessibility for those with limited mobility? For example, the elderly and maybe persons with disability. How can we also embrace this segment of the population in our city, and how can we make our happy and healthy city accessible to all of them as well? So perhaps I could maybe invite Curt. Would you like to maybe share your thoughts about that?
Sure. It's a good question, and certainly there are universal design principles that are available and architects are applying all the time. There are some countries that have specific regulations that require universal design to provide accessibility for those who have disabilities. But in practical terms, in many cases, the same accessibility for a mother with a stroller is required for a person with a wheelchair. So again, we need to look at the universality of access. And there are, I think, more and more increasingly technology solutions that can also be applied. Things like sensors and access controls that really leverage technologies. And there are even some apps now that have some further accessibility options. But again, what doesn't happen enough is engagement with all of those communities on the front end. And so things are planned that create barriers to access. And so while there are design solutions that could easily be applied, while there are technology solutions that could easily be applied, sometimes what's missing is the engagement on the front end to identify what those barriers are. And so designs sometimes get finalized and built that simply miss the opportunity to do that. Obviously the more enlightened architects and planners are placing those, putting those solutions in place. But I think cities and local authorities, governments have a responsibility to look at if there is a need for regulation to enforce these kind of design standards, not make them optional, but make them really a requirement, because as has been pointed out by a number of the panelists, the issue of access and equity and stakeholder engagement and the ability for everyone to enjoy these spaces and amenities is universal. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And I can't agree more, your point about the engagement upstream, you know. I remember about 10 years ago when I was looking at the built environment in the context of preparing for an aging population in one community that is slightly older, it's a Marine Parade. We actually started with an extensive survey pairing younger people and older people, and they went to walk the most common routes in the community, and actually they dutifully noted down everything that didn't work for them as they went around the town, and that provided us a very good basis to start to look at the infrastructure improvements to make it an even more inclusive, age-inclusive community. On the issue of inclusiveness, I wonder if you know, either Brian or Prof or Dean Sima, if you have any added thoughts for us.
Yeah, I think there's a relative urgency in addressing issues of equity of access that have really come to the forefront through the course of the pandemic. And it's not just with the elderly. It's also, I think, across, especially in a place like the United States, you've seen a big impact on people who simply don't have access to mobility solutions, particularly people in lower income groups, where there simply needs to be the provision of equity of access to mobility, to connectivity. I think Curt is right that it's not just about the provision of the social spaces, but it's about how the city is also interconnected and seen as one organism or one constellation that is made up of all of these communities. So I do think there is a certain urgency perhaps in also rethinking the metrics of connectivity and mobility when we think about how we either intervene and adapt our cities for the future or the planning of future cities.
Yeah, if I can add a point from the educational point of view, it's quite important. You know, the way we train architects, designers, in the past, we refer to books, right? And drawings and examples. And we ask the student to learn it and measure the distance and then plan on paper. And now with 3D, you can now do very, you know, exciting BIM and all this 3D manipulation. But none of that could actually replace one experiential learning aspect. So what I used to do, I teach this with a colleague 30 years ago. We make the students go in the wheelchair and take them to a site. I say, go around the HDB estate. And once they do that, they never, ever forget. So it's no longer a paper-based design. They now realize, hey, it takes strength to go up a slope, right? And turning corners. And again, going back to Curt's very important point about connectivity. You take them to a certain distance and then suddenly there's a break. And then you get frustrated, all right? Or you can't get from A to B because there's a gap. So those experiential learning, I think in the educational part, is really, really important. In order to further supplement, you know, our preoccupation with everything digital and IT, I think we need to bring back some of this into our educational experience for the students, especially.
I really love, if I can jump in, I really love that that narrative. And in case you're not aware, the ramp in the 8 house is actually handicap accessible. And in the design process, we had a wheelchair in the office, and the architects on the team were required to sit in this wheelchair to navigate the office. And we actually had built in some of the ramps, so they would sit for an entire day to kind of understand, you know, the perspective from someone who's challenged in their movement and how the kind of slope would affect that access.
Yes, indeed, and I think that can't agree more, and I would say that I see some of the questions in the chat that talks about happiness, and I would say that that there's an elixir of longevity and a drug for happiness actually is about putting younger people and older people together. It's a recipe for happiness, and in Singapore I think many of our developments we have intentionally planned for the childcare and the elder care to be side by side, because this natural interaction between the young and the old actually creates happiness both ways, and also to the education objective that Prof Lam is talking about. I wonder if Dean Sima, if anything to add. If I think we are very much. Okay. I think we are now. Sorry, Dean Sima. Okay. Okay. Thank you everyone for that very interesting discussions on the issue of inclusiveness. I'm afraid we are running out of time, although I do see many the questions just keep coming in. So perhaps in the last few minutes, I thought to maybe recap some of the key themes that we've heard during this very interesting discussion in the last hour or so, and where we fielded several questions to the panel. And I really like the point about, again, putting people in the center, ensuring the connectivity, ensuring that the design facilitates that social bonds between people. And many of our panelists, Dean Sima, for example, Brian, Prof Lam, you talk about actually, it's perfectly possible to create a happy and healthy city, despite the intensely high density kind of context. And it's about, as Prof Lam say, using one thing to solve five users. And I also like to highlight at the end, the point by Curt about always having the access and equity in mind, and also not to forget about some of the very basic elements of a healthy city. And it has been such a wonderful exchange that we have had this afternoon, and actually it's given us a clearer picture on what a healthy and happy city of the future may look like. And I think it's an area where the innovation continues. And as we embark on designing new communities to be happy and healthy, I think there is so much room for us to learn from one another across the globe. And, we are working towards, despite our different circumstances, a single common goal, which is to see that, we have more and more of a healthy and happy cities contributing to the livability, to the resilience of our cities. This is such an exciting space, both at the building level, and the city level, and the community level. And certainly, I think we hope to have the chance to invite many of our panelists back in the future to discuss and to update in terms of the new innovations and new practices that we've put in place to push the boundary in terms of the health and happiness of our cities. So with that, I thought to first thank all our participants. You know, you have been a wonderful audience. This is a virtual session, but I've seen now 39 questions coming in. And, you know, it's a very lively discussion in the chat as well. And then I hope that we'll have more opportunities to also invite our audience back and really have that live exchange. And you know, last but not least, let me really thank all our panelists again, you know, Prof. Lam, Dean Sima, Mr. Garrigan, and Brian, for really taking time and you know, being so generous with your sharing. And it's quite clear that all of our panelists today, right, feel very passionate about this particular topic. So thank you all, and I hope that we've had the chance perhaps to meet in Singapore and continue this really interesting discussion about, you know, building better lives for all our people in our various cities. Let me hand the time back to our MC, Ren Ai.
Thank you, Professor Lam Khee Po, Mr. Sima Xiao, Mr. Curt Garrigan, Mr. Brian Young, and Ms. Teoh Woon for this insightful discussion. We have come to the end of this session. Playbacks of this session will be available on our YouTube channel, where you can also find videos of all our other WCS 2021 sessions. Please do register for our upcoming World City Summit webinar session, Rethinking Global Cities in a New Era, on 18th November 2021. You may register for the next session using the QR code or link on your screen. The Urban Redevelopment Authority of Singapore would like to hear your feedback and ideas on how the city can plan and design for sustainability and climate resilience in the longer term. Do scan the QR code on your screen to share your thoughts. You may also find out more about Singapore's long-term plan review at this website. Coming up in November, the Urban Sustainability R&D eSymposia 2021 will be holding webinars on urban analytics. These webinars will share how we can leverage on digital tools like data analytics and machine learning to improve how we plan our cities. All eSymposia webinars are complimentary, and you can also find out more about them via this QR code. If you have any queries, you can also direct them to the Secretariat's email address as shown. Before you leave, please use the QR code or link to fill in our feedback form. Until our next session, goodbye.